Do you think that that is a serious issue with Australian films, that, you know, they can spend millions of dollars making it, but when it comes to actually putting it out there, there's reluctance, there's not enough resources, there's not enough money put into it? Do you think that that is an issue?
Look, I think that it is for some films, but not all. Because I think of our national industry, like you go into a bookshop, in front of the bookshop there's a Stephen King book and a John Grisham book, but down the back there's shelves with much smaller books, and there's always people looking. It's a smaller audience, but there's people looking. And so I always think across my career I've made books at the front of the shop and at the back of the shop, in the non-fiction section, in the fiction section, you know, biography section, in the kids section now. I mean, I think different films need a different type of release. It's not like a kind of the same model works for everything. What I knew with Paper Planes was there was no way releasing Paper Planes like a small art house film. I needed a big distributor who really believed in it, because otherwise it wouldn't be in the cinemas in the school holidays.
And it's 250 screens, you say?
That's right, it's everywhere.
Are you able to tell me what the budget on the film was?
It was pretty good budget. I tend to not tell the budget,
sure,
just because you know, I'm competing against $200 million films. I'll say that it was less than that.
Excuse me, let me just amend what you just said. You're competing against $200 million films every weekend.
That's right.
I mean, it's a ferocious marketplace out there.
Yeah, and also, you know what I love about Paper Planes too, these school holidays, we're competing, we're not really competing, we're coming after them, but there are big kids films like Annie, Paddington, but they're big existing properties, you know, Annie and Paddington, but we've created something new, like it's a new idea. It makes it harder, but it also does make it exciting. So, you know, that competitive streak in me enjoys that.
Please tell me that somewhere in the back of your mind, somewhere in a drawer somewhere in a file or one of your laptops, you've got an outline for a sequel.
Definitely.
Yes! That's fantastic.
I've had kids come out of the screening wanting to know what happens to different characters. People love the little New Zealander, you know, and they want to know what happens to him.
Fantastic.
No, I've got a few ideas up my sleeve.
Okay, just a couple of housekeeping questions for you. The turning. How does the turning turn out?
Fantastic. I was really excited by that project. In Australia, it made, you know, $1.5 million at the box office, which for what we were doing was a big success. It's opening in the UK and the US in the coming year. But most excitingly, particularly for that project, it's launching a lot of those filmmakers. So Stephen Page, the artistic director of Bangarra, is directing his first feature, Spear, which shoots in 3 weeks. So part of my idea with the turning was to get all these young filmmakers, or new emerging filmmakers, make this bold work, and then out of it make a whole series of other films. And so Spear's the first one. David Wenham has a film he's been writing called Love Machine, and that's financing. So I think the turning will be seen again to have been a catalyst for some new talent.
Are you now ready to take my big critical question about that film?
You fire away.
I thought it was a good film, but I thought, ironically, while it appeared to be a very ambitious film, I actually thought that it could have been much more ambitious, in that, Robert Connolly, it could have been the Australian shortcuts. This is a film that could have had a lot more coherence brought into it, so that despite the fact that it had, you know, nearly 24 directors, it would have held together both as 17 or 18 different stories, but still held together as one story, so that people could enjoy it as a narrative, and thus give us our Australian Robert Altman, which would have been you. That's just
we explored it. We explored doing it more interconnected, like shortcuts. But I really conceived that as something to innovate in the distribution space in a massive way. So I really was trying to create a sense of like going into an art gallery and watching different artworks. And so I didn't want to homogenise it. I wanted it to be really extreme in its boldness. You know, I wanted, you know, Circa did a piece in dance, or, you know, Mia Wasikowska's piece, which is like an early Jane Campion. So early on there were the discussions, and there were ways the stories could be entwined and a little bit more like the shortcuts model. I think to go the shortcuts model, you'd have a singular director. And I don't know if that book was right for it. I think that book kind of lent itself to that kind of anthology of individual works. So that's the good opportunity for someone to make what you're describing. You know, Peter Carey's short stories I think are great. I think there are other collections of short stories that could lend themselves, as you say, to Raymond Carver.
Also,
Robert Drew was another great short story writer.
Another reason to ask that question, and the Water Diviner is really reminding us that Aussies love big Aussie stories.
They do.
They love big Aussie stories.
Yeah. They always have. They always will. And
Speaking
I'm
of which,
optimistic about that.
Speaking of which, you are a producer on Gallipoli.
That's right.
What can we expect?
It's fantastic. I'm so proud of it. Last year, working with director Glendon Ivan in Channel 9 on this massive 8-hour Gallipoli miniseries. It's the biggest, boldest, most ambitious thing I've ever been involved with. We went to Turkey 3 years ago to begin the process, and we've only just finished it a few weeks ago. It tells the Gallipoli campaign from beginning to end. That was part of our ambition, mad as it was. It begins with the boat landing with the young men and ends with the boat leaving 8 months later. The great thing for me, which I love about it, watch this space, young Cody Smith-McPhee, who was the lead in Romulus, My Father, which I produced, is the lead in Gallipoli now at 17, and it is a heartbreaking, extraordinary performance from that young man. I'm so proud of him to have gone from that Romulus, My Father to Gallipoli. Just
to wind up, Bellabo, still one of the most powerful films.
Thank you.
It's even more timely now. Just firstly, how does that film stand in your CV? And secondly, I just want to get some reaction about the decision in December. That the AFP were not going to pursue war crimes.
Oh, it's just devastating. Devastating for the families. And, you know, I think we live in a time where our governments are willing to make very expedient decisions for greater, you know, kind of geopolitical agendas that they have. And I think that there are certain times when governments shouldn't never look beyond the kind of moral obligation they have to terrible things. You know, those men were murdered, and a coroner said they were murdered, and there was a case to answer. And I think it's quite clear that the Australian government's really just taken a step back on that to protect its relationship with Indonesia. The great irony of this is that when you talk to young Indonesian people, I mean, as you know, Bellabo is banned in Indonesia, was released illegally there, it was massive on the black market. And I've met lots of young Indonesian people who love the film. You know, this assumption that everyone in Indonesia is happy to pull, you know, the wool over the world's eyes about what happened in the past. You know, a lot of countries are able to deal with tragic things and move on. So we underestimate a country like Indonesia, you know, when we are so unwilling to kind of confront those things.
And how does Bellabo stand in your CV?
Oh, it's like a gift of an experience in my life. I mean, to go to that country, to make that film there, in the real place where it happened, you know, to work with this amazing group of young actors. You know, I kind of was very restless when I came back from that because it was hard after such a heightened experience. But I'll remain, you know, very indebted to the Timorese people for letting us come into the country, for giving us this incredible, you know, access to their story.